All right, I think we'll get started as I know I see folks are still joining us. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will speak with author David A. Hollinger about his new book, Christianity's American Fate, How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular. I don't know if you can see this. The Zoom is, I think, preventing me from showing it to you. And we're also being joined by University of Notre Dame's Darren Dochuk and GW's Melanie McAllister. A warm welcome to both of you. In fact, to Melanie, welcome back. You have been with us before in one of these sessions. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the pleasure to co-chair this seminar series with Eric Arneson, representing the American Historical Association. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For well more than a decade, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications, something that's central to both of our organizations. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who have produced this event, Rachel Wheatley for the AHA and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. This is very much a shoestring operation, and so we welcome your financial support of this series. Details on how to do that you'll find in the chat now or on our respective institutional websites. A final announcement to say that we invite you to join us next week, Monday, October 24th, for a conversation about Afghan Crucible, the Soviet invasion and the making of modern Afghanistan, with author Elizabeth Lake. Just a quick word on the Q&A part of the seminar, probably around 5 o'clock or so. We'll start with that. For the Q&A, you have two options. This is to our audience. You have two options to intervene, to participate, to join this conversation. You can use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, and once you press the button, you'll be entered into a queue. When the moderator, in this case Eric, calls on you, you will receive a prompt that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please do so. Please press yes, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. You can start getting in line for the Q&A right now. You can also use the Q&A function in the Zoom menu. You can post a comment or a question, and then Eric will put that comment or question to our panelists. Finally, just to note that today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. And with that, I think I've done all the preliminaries. Eric, it's all over to you.
Thank you so much, Christian. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker this afternoon, our author, David A. Hollinger, the Preston Hotchkis Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a former president of the Organization of American Historians, an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His 9 books, I won't mention them all, include Post-Ethnic America Beyond Multiculturalism, first published in 1995 with multiple editions after, Science, Jews, and Secular Culture, published in 1996, After Cloven Tongue of Fire, 2013, and Protestants Abroad, 2017. Today, he is joining us to talk about his Christianity's American Fate, How Religion Became More Conservative and of Society More Secular, published just last week by Princeton University Press. David, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thanks very much. And I want to thank the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center for scheduling this session on a book that appears at a time when we have a lot of books and articles on why evangelicals flock to Trump, but I think not very many books and articles on how the history of American Christianity brought us to the point that this old faith's symbolic capital is largely in the hands of white evangelicals whose culture leads them to appreciate Trump. So my book tries to explain how that happened, how American Christianity has taken the direction that it has. In so doing, I hope to remind people of the importance of religion to basic American history. In 2011, not so many years ago, when I was honored to be president of the Organization of American Historians, I gave in my presidential address a talk having to do with American religion, which was the first OAH presidential address in the then 104-year history of the organization that had anything to do with religion at all. And I think there were plenty of reasons to talk about religion in American history before that. But now, when we have this remarkable paradox of an increasingly secular society as measured by standard indicators, yet we have an increasingly religious politics. This paradox seems to me to invite everyone's attention. I sometimes like to say that religion is too important to be left in the hands of people who believe in it, which may sound sort of ungenerous, but what I have in mind is that religion affects everybody. And if you don't think that you have a dog in the fight between various kinds of religionists, you're wrong, because so much of the exercise of power in the United States depends on who controls the franchise. Now, among historians, there are two closely connected bodies of scholarship to which I see my book as a collegial supplement and to some extent a correction. The first of these two bodies of scholarship is on the rise of the religious right, especially in the 50s and 60s. The second body of scholarship is on the history of evangelical Protestantism during the last 50 or 60 years. Now, neither of these bodies of scholarship, strong and convincing as they are, have very much to say about the historic role of ecumenical mainline Protestants. My book tries to offer a more complete analytic narrative, calling sustained attention to the dynamics of the ecumenical evangelical divide and its historical roots. Now, why is it important to supplement and correct received opinion in this particular way? Well, attention to the dynamics of the ecumenical evangelical divide reveals that the evangelicalism that we see in American public life today took form by rejecting an alternative version of Protestantism that proclaimed a more commodious view of the faith and a more pluralistic, diverse, inclusive view of the American nation. This alternative Protestantism, it is crucial to know, was led by people who were just as white as Billy Graham. Race explains a great deal, but not everything. White people had a choice. Evangelicalism flourished as a safe harbor for white Americans who wanted to be counted as Christians without having to confront two challenges that leaders of the other Protestants, the mainline ecumenical Protestants, said it was the duty of Christians to deal with, however imperfectly, but at least you had to deal with it. One challenge was that of an ethnoracially diverse society. The other challenge was that of a scientifically informed culture. White evangelicalism achieved definition during the middle decades of the 20th century by rejecting this easily available alternative liberal Protestantism. Just as the fundamentalism of the 1920s was defined by the modernist movement of that age, the evangelicalism of the post-World War II decades was defined by the liberal Protestantism against which the evangelicals worked. Now, the leaders of this old Protestant establishment, and I mean the Methodists, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, the Disciples, the Episcopalians, and so forth, the leaders of this old Protestant establishment presented white Protestants with a choice. They could try to build a Protestantism more responsive to social, cultural, and intellectual change, or they could treat those changes as beside the point of an ostensibly unchanging gospel. So in the context of that disagreement, the mainline leaders of the 1940s pressed upon their parishioners an obligation to oppose Jim Crow at home and colonialism abroad. Resolution after resolution from the Federal Council of Churches, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Congregationalists, the Methodists, and the Church Women United, very important new organization during the 40s. All these resolutions condemn white supremacy, not simply as an evil of the human heart, but as a civic problem to be overcome through political action. The mainline establishment welcomed Howard Thurman, Channing Tobias, Benjamin Mays into its councils and leadership. As early as 1942, the ecumenicals refused to hold their conventions in cities where Black delegates would be refused service. In the meantime, the evangelicals continued holding their meetings in St. Louis and other Jim Crow cities. Now, these ecumenical leaders pressed the new United Nations, in the creation of which they actually had a quite strong hand, to facilitate the end of the old European empires. Their campaign took a generous view of non-Christian faiths within the United States and abroad. And one of the most interesting actions at the UN meeting in San Francisco was that the liberal Protestants from the United States, allied with Jewish groups, succeeded in defeating an effort by the European delegates to include in the UN Charter the right to proselytize. This was called religious freedom, the right to proselytize. The liberal Protestants argued that such a provision would be unfair to Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and any non-Christian. So the campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism had very strong international dimensions and domestic dimensions. Around the United States, they argued for sex education in public schools. They supported Alfred Kinsey's research on human sexuality. They supported a historical understanding of the Bible as the work of many different authors living in different centuries. The 15-volume Interpreter's Bible was the great monument of the ecumenical leadership's biblical hermeneutics during that time. FDR's White House was well aware of this campaign and invited a convention of 400 ecumenical leaders to discuss a draft of Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, which he then presented to the public in his State of the Union message of 1944. So my book traces the history of this campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, noting the opposition that it generated from the evangelical leadership, which had many complaints about these liberal Protestants, especially the failure of the liberal Protestants to affirm unambiguously that the United States was a Christian nation and should always remain that. The liberal Protestants moved away from that in the 1950s and 60s very decisively. But in the late 1960s, the mainline churches begin their famous decline in numbers and in influence. Why was this? Did some of the ecumenicals switch to evangelical churches? Yes, some did, but actually not very many. The big decline of ecumenical Protestantism is more effectively explained by other factors. There was a massive exodus of young people, people that were born into ecumenical churches during the 1960s, 70s, and after, did not join the churches of their parents, caught up in the cultural and political movements of the time. A lot of them decided they didn't need churches, and they left the churches in droves. Another thing, the ecumenicals had lower birth rates than ever before, and much lower than the evangelicals. And the lower birth rates don't occur in a cultural vacuum, of course. This is heavily influenced by ecumenical attitudes toward contraception, toward women in the workforce. There was also the difficulty in terms of why ecumenical Protestantism declines, difficulty of recruiting new members from evangelical churches. Now, this is important because during the late 40s and 50s and early 60s, most of the increase in numbers of the ecumenical churches consisted of recruiting people from the Seventh-day Adventists, from the Nazarenes and so forth. As these evangelical families achieved upward social mobility, they often became mainline. But then gradually, you didn't have to do that anymore. The ecumenical establishment had done such a great job of establishing its institutions and its place in American society that you no longer had to be mainline to be mainstream. Also, the ecumenicals required you to sort of deal with all these matters about science and diversity, and that was hard sometimes to recruit people in that context. So what happens then is over the course of the second half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st, there are these two massive changes going in opposite directions. You have an increase of religiously unaffiliated people, the nuns, as they call them in social science, the people who say none when they ask if they have a religious affiliation. That's now 29% of the public will answer that way to a Gallup poll. No, I don't have any religious affiliation. That's just astonishingly high, given the history of the United States. Second thing that happens is an increase of evangelicals seeking the safe harbor, seeking a safe harbor from these other challenges. But rather than detail the chronological narrative of the book on all of that, I think it is more important here to enumerate what I at least take to be the features of this book that make it the most different from the other books on the shelves to which it is likely to be headed. And I want to list 6 of these briefly, and then I'll close up and hear what our friends have to say. One thing that I think makes this book really different from all other books about American Protestantism is that there's lots in it about Jews, about non-Christians. So I'm arguing here that the course of de-Christianization of American public culture, of secularization, depends heavily on a conspicuous Jewish population, not large in numbers, but very important in cultural location. So a lot on Jews as agents of challenge to the old Anglo-Protestant cultural hegemony. Second, there's a lot in this book about missionaries. Well, I wrote a book about missionaries about 5 years ago, and I encapsulate that in a chapter here, arguing that the missionaries have a liberalizing effect on the Protestant intelligentsia, leading toward this campaign for more cosmopolitan Protestantism that I described a while ago. So experience abroad, I should have entitled that book, The Protestant Boomerang. It's just entitled Protestants Abroad, which doesn't quite get at the dynamic. And the dynamic, of course, is all these Protestants go to China or wherever, and they come back critical of American provinciality because they've experienced the rest of the world. So these are the people, these are the people who take the lead in all these ecumenical organizations. They edit the magazines, they supervise all the conferences, they write all the resolutions. A third thing is that I make a lot of the concept of post-Protestant. Now, the importance of that category is to break down the secular religion dichotomy. We have all these conversations about how people cease to be religious and then they become secular. Okay, but often when you become secular, you carry with you what your previous experience was. Now, this is an idea that I developed partly under the inspiration of Martin Marty, who 52 years ago wrote a book in which he emphasized what he called the Protestant deposit. The Protestant deposit, looked at sort of geologically. Marty argued, and I'm convinced that this is true, that a Protestant upbringing affects what kind of secularist you become. So there's a lot in this book and my other writings, but especially in this book, about post-Protestants as a particular kind of being in American society. Fourth, there's the matter of how to interpret progressive initiatives within evangelicalism. Now, when I was writing this book and sending chapters around and doing talks here and there, one of the most common topics that came up. Topic concern was, well, David, you've got to be sure that you deal with the diversity and complexity of American evangelicals. And especially you have to attend to the fact that many of these people are actually quite progressive. So I took this to heart, did a lot of reading in that area. And the more I read, the more I was struck by what seems to me to be a really important syndrome. And if somebody else writing about Protestantism had made this point, I'd be glad to know about it, but I didn't see it anywhere. There's a dynamic of appropriation and effacement. The progressive evangelicals very extensively take ideas from the hated liberals, from the scorned ecumenicals, and advance them as their own ideas. Now, I don't think it's cause for lament that a lot of these evangelicals are developing different ideas. Somebody else will pick up this phone. I'm sorry about that. I don't think it's a cause for lament that a lot of the evangelicals are changing their minds about some things. I don't think it's cause for lament that a lot of them are finding appeal in some of the ideas that ecumenicals have advanced over the years. What I found striking was how rarely this continuity was acknowledged. And I'll give you a prominent example that some of you may have seen. In February, David Brooks of the New York Times published a huge essay that covered like 2 full inside pages as well as the cover on what he saw as very promising changes within evangelicalism. And we're invited to feel warm and wonderful about all this. We've got to get away, says Brooks, from this notion that Josh Hawley and Franklin Graham are somehow representative of evangelicals. Okay, but what was interesting to me about this is that almost everything that he mentioned was a liberal Protestant idea, which was now being advanced by these evangelicals. And I found several other cases like that. So I say it's appropriation and effacement because you appropriate the liberal Protestant tradition long scorned, but yet you don't acknowledge that continuity. Now, one of the things that this did for me is to reinforce my understanding of the nature of the evangelical ecumenical divide and of the prophetic role, relatively speaking, of the ecumenical leaders that tried to develop progressive ideas during the 1940s, 50s, and so forth. Fifth thing that I think distinguishes this book from a lot of others is that I haven't seen anywhere else as pointed and sustained an effort to refute the Dean Kelly thesis. Now, the Dean Kelly thesis is not widely known among most American historians because the field has been so isolated and insulated, just as American religious history. Dean Kelly, in 1972, writes a book saying, evangelical churches are flourishing because they make real demands on people. Liberal Protestant churches are declining because they're offering only weak tea. So it's a matter of demanding something of individuals. That's what makes religion really tick. Now, what I found was just the opposite. I mean, I found that evangelicalism was a safe harbor for people that did not want to face demands. They did not want to face the demands of a scientifically informed culture. They did not want to face the demands of an ethnoracially diverse society. And evangelical leaders encourage them to stick with them, to stick with the evangelical churches. Don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. What did it mean to accept Christ for Billy Graham? Well, I'm not sure that it was so demanding. Maybe it was demanding for some people to be loyal to your spouse, to avoid pornography, to avoid same-sex intimacy. There's a whole list of things that are very common in the Billy Graham milieu. I'm not sure that they're so demanding. But as we look at the history of this society over the last 50, 100 years, when we want to talk about what the demands were, I think that the demands of a scientific culture and the demands of an ethno-racially diverse society are greater. Sixth and last, in terms of what I think makes the book different from most of the others on the shelf, I try to invoke a world historical frame. A lot of our histories of American religion and American Protestantism operate within a national frame. Whereas I'm treating Christianity as a particular world historical project with many different franchises. So I say that what happens in the United States is that Christianity changes depending on who holds the franchise, and that you have many different readings of the faith are possible. An example that I came across recently of how really different I think this frame of reference is from what you often see. Michael Gerson, a very intelligent writer for the Washington Post, had a column here a week or two ago lamenting the evangelical enthusiasm for Trump and for a lot of the things that Trump stands for. And as I read Gerson, he's saying, these people just don't understand what real Christianity is. So Gerson's answer is what? Go back to the Bible. So we get these quotes from Jesus of Nazareth, and they're great quotes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff from the Sermon on the Mount, a little bit from the book of James. So Matthew 25, I was hungry and you fed me, so forth. Yeah, that's there. But we need to remember that this notion of, we know what real Christianity is just by going back to the Bible, that's what they all say. That's what the slave owners say. You want a really sophisticated understanding of the Bible? You want something written by people who really knew the text well, people with world historical sophistication? Try the pro-slavery argument. These people had a very good argument, and it was okay with slavery. And how did they do this? They did it exactly the same way that Michael Gerson did. They went back to the Bible. So I'm saying, to pull back from that, see Christianity in all its versions as a world historical project, which is taken in different directions by different people at different times. And what we have now is, you might say, a bubble on the ocean of the history of Christianity, but it's a very important one. So what then is the fate of Christianity in the United States? Not sure, but I would say two things about it. One is, I think its fate is to be a stepping stone to something else. That's why post-Protestantism is so important. That's why this decline of religious affiliation is so important. That's one thing. The rest of the fate of Christianity depends on who controls it, who has the franchise. Is it possible that Christianity's fate in the United States is to become an ongoing refuge for the most conservative of Americans, theologically, culturally, politically? Perhaps, not sure, but that's a real struggle. And the non-Christians who think they don't have a dog in that fight are wrong. I'll stop there.
David, thank you very, very much. I think we'll have a lot to talk about. And to get that conversation going, I'm pleased to introduce Melanie McAllister, Professor of American Studies and International Affairs at the George Washington University. A cultural historian focused on the United States and the world, her most recent monograph is The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, A Global History of American Evangelicals, published by Oxford in 2018. It's forthcoming in paperback shortly. She is also co-editor of Global Faith, Worldly Power, Evangelical Internationalism and U.S. Empire, UNC Press, 2022, and The Cambridge History of America and the World, the fourth volume, Cambridge, 2021. She's also the author of Epic Encounters, Culture, Media, and U.S. Interests in the Middle East. She currently serves on the board of directors of the American Council of Learned Societies, the editorial boards of Modern American History, Diplomatic History, and American Quarterly, as well as several committees for the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Her next project is a cultural history and an effective history of Third World solidarity in the late Cold War. Melanie, welcome to the seminar. Good to have you here again.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. And I'm such a pleasure to get to talk about this book, which is so rich and expansive and yet concise at the same time. If you haven't read it, it's a very readable book. that goes over a lot of territory in big questions about the history of religion and its role in the US in a way that is, I think, quite accessible and beautifully written. I learned a lot from this book, even though I've read basically everything David's ever written. I still learned many new things from this particular book. And I really think in David's role as one of the most important intellectual and religious historians working in the US, he shows himself in this book to be not only a historian for historians, but, and I mean this as a compliment, a historian also for theorists. That's to say, he's interested in big questions about ethical positioning, of how to think about what kinds of activities and what ways of being in the world support possibilities for living democratically, supporting liberalism's best components, and engaging ethically with each other. So the stakes of the argument in this book are not merely historiographical. They are here and elsewhere in his work, epistemological, political, and also moral. And I particularly appreciate his consistent insistence that a major issue for thinking about Christianity in the United States is its attitude towards other religions. And, as somebody who's very concerned about Christian views of Islam, this resonated a lot with me, and which I really appreciate. So under this rubric of his work, I want to point out two key arguments that David makes. He said it pretty beautifully himself, but I'll just say it quickly. Two key points that he makes, and then I want to raise 2 points of discussion and a question. So one is that the survival or failure to thrive of American ecumenical Protestantism is not actually key to understanding its historical role. That what Protestant did as a kind of enabling context, what ecumenical Protestantism did as an enabling context for many aspects of contemporary liberalism, including racial liberalism, women's rights, activism on economic equality, environmentalism, etc., meant that we can see the arrival of post-Protestantism not as a failure of ecumenicalism, but actually as an achievement. That unless you're, as David said, unless you're a survivalist, unless your goal is to make sure that Christianity survives in a certain form or another, that doesn't have to be your concern. You can see what ecumenical Protestantism offered historically to the US and be interested in and even celebratory of what that was able to offer. Second, as David has said, he really wants to make sure that the ecumenical liberal story of Protestantism is told together with the story of evangelicals and with the story of American Jews, and to see those in relationship to each other. And he's right, that there really is nobody else who does that kind of work, who sees all of these and writes about them so intimately in relationship to each other, that they are intertwined histories, in fact. And when he writes another fatter version of this, we might include Catholicism as well, more integrally into the story of how these different religions shape each other, because certainly evangelicals were as shaped by their fear of Catholicism as they were, for example, of the ecumenical Protestantism. I'd also love to hear more about the history of non-religion as well, which I'm going to come back to at the end. So 2 points of discussion, a brief comment, and a suggestion. So the first point of discussion, David and I have a very friendly but ongoing disagreement about how to understand the appeal of evangelicalism in the United States. And I do see that at play here. There's a moment when he says that the ecumenicals made a mistake when they dismissed evangelicals as country cousins. And I think he's trying pretty hard not to do that, but that in fact, they do kind of come off as a little bit people who aren't willing to work very hard, either intellectually or morally, to face the challenges of the 20th century and the 21st century. Now, when I say that, I want to say that I've been misunderstood, I think, in my own work at times as kind of defending evangelicals in general or white evangelicals, because I focus so much on the debates among them, of the different ways that people are arguing with each other, especially around issues of race and my work on race, international affairs, and gender that were pretty central to the 20th century. I don't talk much about science, and it's one of the real appeals of David's book that he does. But I think for me, it's no longer unusual to highlight the ways that evangelicals were deeply divided and remain deeply divided over a number of different issues. And so there's great work by David Chappelle, Helen Kim, Mark Newman, Alan Willis, Stephen Haynes, David Schwartz, Derek Chang, Randall Stevens, Darren Dudchik, and others who really highlight a range of kind of debates among evangelicals that have real significance. And I think in this book, David does a better job of seeing and unpacking the complexity and nuance of ecumenical Protestantism than evangelicals, especially around issues of race. Now, there's no version of the history of evangelicals in which race and racism is not a problem. It's a big problem. But there is a reality that this problem was recognized, discussed, and debated from early on. So, as one Southern Baptist missionary put it in 1946, writing in the official journal, the Women's Missionary Union, she says, "We cannot expect the pagan peoples of the world, most of whom are dark-skinned, to have faith in our gospel, which teaches the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, when our actions deny our professions." That's 1946. That's the official journal of the Southern Baptist Convention. There's other views, however, also in the Southern Baptist Convention. And these are the kind of things we're more familiar with from the historiography. William A. Criswell, who was a beloved Southern Baptist minister, famously denounced Brown versus Board by insisting that it was, quote, against all the things we love as good old Southern people and good old Southern Baptists. And he goes on, speaking of Northerners, to literally shout in his sermon, let them integrate, let them sit up there in their dirty shirts and make all their fine speeches, that they are a bunch of infidels dying from the neck up. So there's a debate. There's a real debate about race in the Southern Baptist Convention, among evangelicals overall, in the National Association of Evangelicals. But sometimes I feel like the evangelicals in this book are too much of a uniform bunch. There's a moment, for example, and this is just a slightly different version where David talks about, and it's a very scary moment actually, that he talks about the NAE calling for a constitutional amendment that would, quote, recognize the law and authority of Jesus, which is, a truly scary proposition and a very important story to be told. The NAA, the National Association of Evangelicals. But in that same moment, the Southern Baptist Convention, which was the largest Protestant denomination in the country, and was not and never has been a member of the National Association of Evangelicals, it's a very complicated story then, but the Baptists were very strongly defending church-state separation, at least at times. So in the late 1930s, the Baptists produced an official statement that says, believing religious liberty to be not only an unalienable human right, but indispensable to human welfare, a Baptist must exercise himself to the utmost in the maintenance of absolute religious liberty for his Jewish, his Catholic, his Protestant neighbor, and for everyone else. Now, maybe we shouldn't take either the National Association of Evangelicals or the Southern Baptist Convention statements too much at face value. The debate over the meaning of religious freedom is one of the most fraught issues among all evangelicals, and lots of people talked out of both sides of their mouth about it at different points over the course of the 20th century. But there's something crucial, I would argue, about knowing this history in order to know that the current cascade of retrograde evangelical views of religious freedom only for Christians, which is really where we've been going for the last 20 or more years, is not the outcome of some kind of evangelical essence, but the product of historical struggle among evangelicals themselves. So the second comment I would make, or point of discussion, is that I think that the racial diversity of evangelicalism matters more than David does. David explicitly says that, it can be kind of just silly to point out that there are Black evangelicals when Black evangelicals, like people in the AME Church, have such a different view politically than the Presbyterian Convention of America or other, largely white denominations. And I think that's right, that if you just say, oh, there are Black people who have evangelical views too, that doesn't tell you very much. But there were and are people who are Black and identifiably evangelical, and I'm going to name some contemporary ones: T.D. Jakes, Creflo Dollar, the recently deceased Bishop Harry Jackson, who was on Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, Thabiti Anyabwile, who's a minister here in D.C., and one of the members of the group of Black Southern Baptist Convention preachers who've been raising issues of race within the SBC pretty hard, and have actually fractured the Southern Baptist Convention over issues of race by raising issues within it as Black SBC ministers. So they're not invisible and they're not without power, as the same is true, I would say, with Latino, Arab, and Asian American evangelicals. Asian American evangelicals, Asian Americans, by the way, are 7% of the US population, but well over 40% of the membership of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, the most important collegiate evangelical organization. So I think if your goal is to understand American religious history, the rise of non-white evangelicalism and its impact on institutions that were once presumed to be white is really important and something to really talk a little bit more about. Now, I think we may find that evangelicalism really does actually end up splitting into white segments and people of color segments, but that's not the story of the last 30 years. Okay, one quick comment and one suggestion. One comment from my own research, and I think it's just an irony, is that David's so right to talk about how fearful evangelicals were of ecumenism throughout most of the 20th century. But in the last 20 years, evangelicals have become ecumenical in a certain way. They've emerged as part of what I call in a more recent work, a transnational conservative ecumenical coalition. That is, they're working with Catholics and Orthodox around the world, and sometimes even Muslims and others as part of the pro-family and anti-LGBTQ agenda on the world stage. So as part of the World Congress of Families, the Putin Fan Club, work on the U.S. Commission on the U.S. UN Commission on the Family. There is a kind of evangelical Orthodox Catholic network that is of people working together in new ways to promote highly, highly conservative views about sexuality and gender. So the last thing is a suggestion. I have an idea for David's next book. So there are a lot of times in this book where he talks about how ecumenicals accepted modern science and evangelicals didn't. And I think there's something fundamentally correct about that, and it really does matter. And I know, especially now when we see in COVID times, people who are explicitly anti-science, and a lot of those folks are evangelicals. But I think I would describe all of us, post-Protestant, from post-Protestant to evangelical homeschooler, as operating with a mix of scientific and highly non-scientific thinking. I'm thinking Midwestern Methodists with crystals, or Catholics and post-Protestants alike getting psychic readings, or the popularity of ghost hunting television or zombie movies. Our fascination with and our dread of science gone amok tales like robot killers and the used to be science fiction stories of deadly pandemics. I think a lot of evangelicals will claim to doubt science and then get on planes and get laser surgery on their eyes and help their kids with their biology homework. And I think a number of post-Protestant secularists would talk about believing in the science and then also talk about what the universe wants for them, don't get me started, or chant Om during their yoga classes with reverence, or become hippie anti-vaxxers. So I would love to see David write a book about our post-secular society of spiritual but not religious people. There are scholars working on that, of course, but I think David would do it with the same breadth of knowledge and rigorous curiosity that he brought to this book and to his previous work, and I think that would be fabulous. That's it.
Melanie, thank you so much. David, perhaps there's something you'd like to respond to.
The one thing I would say, and we can talk more about this as we go on, is that in I think almost every case, the observations that Melanie makes are of the sort that I was hoping that this little book could generate more discussion of those things. And as I'm not somebody that claims I've got it all figured out, the strongest feelings that I bring to this book are that there are a lot of things that are insufficiently scrutinized and not dealt with sufficient persistence and honest inquiry, and all these things about where the Catholics are and just how much we do with Black evangelicals. I'm glad to see more on that, and I'm willing to grant that I probably didn't push as hard as I might have in any of those domains. There are a couple of specific things that I will want to pick up on later in her comments, especially about divisions within evangelicalism and how we are to interpret them. But I'll let it go now for that and hear from Darren, and then maybe I'll come in a little bit before we go to the Q&A.
Very good. Sure. Well then, our second discussant this afternoon is Darren Dochuk, who is the Andrew V. Takacs College Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. He's published widely in 20th century US history with a focus on religion and politics, the rise of the right, and energy humanities. He is the author of Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made America, Modern America, published by Basic Books in 2019, and From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Conservatism, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism, published by Norton in 2011. His most recent co-edited volumes include Religion and Politics Beyond the Culture Wars, New Directions in a Divided America, published 2021, and with Gerald Poder, The Rutledge History of the 20th Century United States, Rutledge 2020. Darren, welcome to the seminar. The Zoom screen is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Eric, Christian, Rachel, and all of those folks who made this possible. It's just an honor to be here with you all. Honor to be with Melanie and David, scholars I've long respected and I've learned so much from. And I sense I'll learn more today. In Christianity's American Fate, David has done the near impossible. Marshall in 150 tidy pages, decades of religious history to explain American Christianity's and democracy's current crisis. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about the book, I wondered what was left to be said about a movement whose outsized role in Trump populism has garnered so much attention. As David noted, pundits have hurriedly offered their takes, varying in nuance, on why it is that 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and how it is that a majority of them still embrace his worldview. In too many books to count, we've seen evangelicalism's racism and toxic masculinity, white nationalism and conspiratorial thinking, anti-statism and authoritarianism revealed. We've learned about a born-again Christianity that has gone Old Testament in a quest for dominion. And we have come to realize that despite what its minority of never-Trumpers say, evangelicalism has championed Trumpism because of, not in spite of, its internal logics. After digesting David's book, I realized that my doubts were unfounded. Yes, his is another indictment of right-wing evangelicalism. As he asserts, contrary to the view that evangelicalism is a benign presence in American life, hijacked by others, I argue that evangelicalism's history prepared it to be just what it showed itself to be in the era of Donald Trump. Yet as searing as his critique of evangelicalism is, he in fact captures the tendencies of this movement and the religious and political developments in which they took shape with unmatched efficiency and depth. At a time when titillating Trump exposés hog space atop Amazon's bestseller list, Christianity's American Fate stands out as a judicious think piece worth one's care. There are a number of reasons why I think highly of this book, and I'll say beginning with its style. The Cliff Notes approach to understanding Trumpism is a popular one these days. David's concise history follows the blueprint, but never at the cost of smart analysis and writing. And again, there are too many illustrative quotes to highlight here. Suffice to say, I have a very marked up book and my Sharpie did run dry. Nor is the book devoid of passion. Having appreciated the rigor of David's scholarship, I wasn't surprised that this book made me think differently about the nation's religious past. But I also felt the words in a way that caught me off guard. Writing as a secular post-Protestant, David bears his soul here with some vulnerability, allowing notes of personal investment and urgency to animate his cogent prose. Which brings me to a few substantive reflections about the book, and there's much to highlight here, no chance of doing so, let alone covering it all. And we've already heard a few really important points mentioned that David can pick up on in conversation. But I'm just going to raise four features, again, some that already echo what has been said. Features of the book that I think are fresh in their own right, but that will also hopefully be worthy of elaboration on David's part and perhaps discussion by the group as a whole. First, a defining strength of Christianity's American fate is its attention to the plight of liberal mainline Protestantism. Rather than chart evangelicalism's political ascent in a vacuum, as most texts in the genre do, David maps out its maneuvers in the context of a dialectical struggle with non-evangelical Protestantism. If citizens want to know how American democracy got co-opted by a segment of the population committed to ideas that most other Americans reject, they need to track the decades-long assault evangelicals waged against their ecumenical counterparts. Armed with simple answers to life's mysteries, evangelicalism had built-in advantages where winning the masses was concerned. But David's emphasis is on contingency. Quote, evangelicalism achieved its character, and I'd add power, by rejecting a Christian alternative with markedly different implications for democracy and for the boundaries of the national community. The first part of this book indeed details this culture war, and with thickest details, the fall from hegemony of the mainline side. David has written extensively about cultural forces that worked for and against ecumenical Protestantism as it navigated the tumult of the mid-20th century. The rising influence of secular thought, immigration, disruptions of the mainline Protestant missionary experience, decolonization and pluralism, all these factors ultimately led to an undermining of ecumenist confidence in their mission and acquiescence to post-Protestant secular identities and causes. Race and region, David writes here, guaranteed ecumenical Protestantism's demise. When LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, he knew the Democrats had lost the South for a generation. So crucial was maintenance of white Southern segregation to the democratic order. As David notes, if lacking a single dramatic moment like the one Johnson memorialized, the dynamic for cosmopolitan Protestantism was the same. Even at the cost of losing a major segment of its constituency, its leaders decided to align with the civil rights cause. The Republican Party's Southern strategy of rallying Southern evangelicals around whiteness followed. God's own party was taking shape. Reading David's book, one is struck with the profundity of this move. Faced with mounting pressures against his traditional precepts, ecumenical Protestantism splintered and succumbed. David's fast-moving chapters, more so than his books perhaps, leave the reader pondering the bombardments and stiff odds that ecumenists faced. And the odds were even greater than he fully acknowledges, perhaps worth consideration. Ecumenical Protestantism's fate rested on the fortunes of an entire New Deal liberal order, and when that system faltered, so too did the progressive church. Meanwhile, no mere political strategy concocted by politicos, the GOP's courting of the South and its Bible believers also meant the erection of a political economy in which evangelicals would thrive. Here, Kirkpatrick Sale's power shift explains more than the work of Kevin Phillips, articulator of the Southern strategy. As Sale's mid-70s treatise offered, it was the South's flourishing sectors of energy and agribusiness, leisure and real estate, tech and defense that made its future so bright. These were the sectors in which neoliberalism would redefine America. These were the zones of capital extraction, production, and consumption that would set the nation's course. From Nassau to Silicon Valley, West Texas to Central California, by populating these tech and market frontiers with their mega churches and ministries, corporations and nonprofits, evangelicals have not only thrived in, but come to own this economic order, allowing their magical thinking about God and mammon and about the nation itself to set the terms for all of us. A boon for the evangelical right, the power shift damaged Protestantism's ecumenical wing, yet David doesn't fully portray it that way, here offering a second reflection. Reading David's take on the transitions within ecumenical Protestantism, one is struck by the tone. The plight of liberalism is referenced here as noble sacrifice. He insists that the decline of mainline Protestantism was a sign of victory, not defeat. By choosing to lead crusades for social justice, liberal Protestants took their convictions into the public sphere. There, in government instead of the church, in nonprofits instead of the parish, they tried to shape society according to a purer faith. Secularization was their salvation. On this point, a simple reinterpretation of accepted sociology caught my eye. Apparently, it caught David's as well. In 1972, Dean Kelly, an executive with the Liberal National Council of Churches, published Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, a study in sociology of religion. His thesis was that evangelical churches were growing because they did what liberal churches rejected, make serious doctrinal demands of their congregants. Conservative churches were ascending by offering strong religion premised on theological purity, strict membership and separation from the secular. This in contrast to liberal ones that had lowered requirements to gain cultural acceptance. For Kelly, the trade-off was a bad one. For David, as he's already noted, the opposite is true. It was ecumenical Protestants who demanded more of their brethren. If one wants to account for the decline of the mainline, look to the courage of the ecumenists circa 1972, the courage that they demanded. Intellectually, the faithful now wrestled with a dizzying range of new ideas that unsettled the soul. To stand with ecumenists politically was to stare in the face of violent enemies who sought to defend white Christian America. Such commitment was not for the weak-kneed devotee. Writing with the earnestness of a post-Protestant, David forces us to rethink the boundaries between sacred and secular in quite compelling fashion. In pursuing social causes and secular alliances, he writes, ecumenical leaders blurred the boundaries of their faith community, threatened their churches with extinction, and lost to evangelicals more and more of the authority to speak for Protestantism. I'm convinced, and we'll just say that I won't ever teach Kelly's report on 1970s religion quite the same way. Meanwhile, what about those evangelicals who, amid the global tumult of the post-1970s period, also refashioned their theologies in ways that blurred sacred secular bounds, making this a story of how American religion, as well as society, became more conservative and secular at the same time. David makes mention of other forces of change that worked to unseat ecumenical Protestantism. And here I'm taking with dynamics that made evangelical magic thinking about God, mammon, and morality global. Melanie is the authority here. She's already spoken a bit to this. But on this third point, I'd simply like to highlight David's invaluable discussion about the double whammy liberal Protestants encountered when they came to realize that their missionary efforts abroad were not just faulty, but futile. Painfully, they learned that emerging global Christianity would be conservative to the core, marking another boon for the evangelical side. Indeed, David's is a fascinating glance at large-scale transformations that have made evangelicalism so formidable as of late, one that deserves even more unpacking, perhaps. In the face of what they perceive to be secular humanist trends, and amid their own rapid ascent to new political and cultural heights in the paradigm-shifting 70s, American evangelicals leaned on their global partners for help. The networks they had helped establish in the post-World War II years fueled and facilitated their ambitions. By the 1970s, Korean evangelicals were welcoming Billy Graham to share the gospel with hundreds of thousands. There to assist the evangelists were Korean pastors like Billy Kim. Meanwhile, a charismatic movement was broadening evangelicalism's parameters and global reach, melding expectations of miracles, a mysterious but all-powerful God, and the transformative power of personalized faith with trust in free markets, prayers for prosperity, and traditional family values as shields against Satan. Pentecostals the world over redefined what it meant to be evangelical, and American society felt the effects. David captures some of this, yet understandably in limited fashion. Worth fleshing out even more, I think, is the scale of this revolution within evangelicalism and its impact on reshaping its populist politics in our time. On US shores, an animated evangelicalism bolstered by its global reach has welcomed a multicultural class of culture warriors to its rank. Were David to attend high school in Southern California today, his religious adversaries would likely be second-generation Korean evangelical youth, not white Southern transplanted ones. Meanwhile, in global context, the charismatic infused evangelicalism of our time has helped undergird a populist politics of revolt that seeks to upend national and international establishments with an anti-status, anti-liberal politics that counts on the help of strongman leaders, militarism, and strict enforcement of moral codes to usher in the millennium, or at very least prepare society for that anticipated end. In short, when contemplating the fate of Christianity and democracy, one is left wondering if any of this is in American hands to decide. A daunting outlook, to be sure, which leads to a final cluster of questions. I've highlighted some historical developments touched upon in Christianity's American fate, yet there's so much more to ruminate on this book's last pages. Chapters 8 and 9 are indeed impassioned pleas for a reimagined post-Protestantism of sort. While on one hand, David critiques liberals for abandoning the theological rigor of their forebears, allowing biblical literacy to be weaponized by the right. On the other, he encourages them to look to the legacies of the mainline for inspiration. Despite the prejudices, short-sightedness, and all, the cosmopolitan Protestants of yesteryear demonstrated a world vision worth revisiting for its antidotes to current anti-democratic trends. In their thoughtful, engaged, secular applications of faith rest potentials for wresting control of the Christian franchise from the conservatives. But beyond inspiration, what is there to do? How can the paradox of conservative religious political control be addressed? And here again, predictably, perhaps I'm left with questions of a practical sort. David offers some suggestions, one being the promotion of robust humanist pedagogy in higher education. The humanities, as distinguished from technical and vocational training, which has less decisive consequences for citizenship, he writes, have greater capacity to shape citizens' democratic participation. A critical corrective indeed, yet as highlighted above, the problem is a structural one. Since its earliest battles with science, evangelical pedagogy has embraced common sense pragmatism, spurred on by their populist impatience and low church instrumentalism. Evangelicals proceeded to construct their own infrastructure of knowledge making to spread their truths. That infrastructure now benefits from the fortunes of a political economy Kirkpatrick's sale alerted us to. Bolstered by profits in the sector's sale singled out, private evangelical schools enjoy the freedom to teach their faith-based curricula. Meanwhile, in mammoth public institutions across the region, evangelical-friendly technical and vocational training reigns supreme. Want to study petroleum geology without questioning biblical time? We can find you a university in Texas. Upending this system will be a tall order indeed. What about political answers? David offers suggestions for addressing the current crisis, for instance, by marshaling the wherewithal of an African-American church that has resisted white evangelical trends. Beyond that, what strategies for escaping the paradox rest in the realm of political strategy? As mentioned above, the Southern strategy of Nixon's time was more than clever partisan maneuver for votes, but it was that as well. And as several scholars have noted recently, the very notion of a polarized America is a manufactured one, designed by politicos on the right for partisan gains. Does a liberalism informed by post-Protestant designs possess any such tools, any such potentials? Finally, what about evangelicals themselves? And David has addressed some of this already. I'm sheepish to ask the type of question one might hear at a political debate. Tell me what you like about your opponent. I've read several books recently about evangelicalism and Trump populism. Invariably, those written by scholars closer to the evangelical inside emphasize the repertoire of democratic thought and action that exists within evangelicalism. Witnessed in the past, perhaps, does evangelicalism possess any potentials for imagining a new path forward? These are questions I'd rather ask than answer, but I applaud David for taking them on in the last pages of his book. Tellingly, his last chapter is the shortest. It would be even shorter if I had written it. But I applaud him for addressing this urgent subject and for providing readers, hopefully many readers, the opportunity to thoughtfully re-examine the path that got us here. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Darren. David?
I'm thrilled to have it said that somebody is convinced by my argument against the Kelly thesis, having encountered this for such a long time. It's very refreshing to hear Darren say that he was convinced by that. I'm delighted that Darren brought into our discussion of the book the LBJ analogy on liberal Protestants giving up something and paying a price for it. And I thought that was analogous to LBJ, and I'm glad that he mentioned that. That's an important part of the book for me. I'm also pleased that he pushes even farther than Melanie did in her comments the notion I have of ecumenical Protestantism as having actually won from a world historical point of view. That I'm saying that ecumenical Protestantism functioned, to use a biblical term, as an earthen vessel, that there were trajectories, interests, values, goals beyond Christianity that Christianity has served as a vehicle for. So you could say that the ecumenical Protestants were earthen vessels for the production of an Enlightenment-inspired modernity that the ecumenical Protestants were part of. So yes, I play with this notion that the ecumenical Protestants may have lost the church, but they won the country. That's hyperbolic, but much of the book is a variation on that theme as to why the hyperbole contains an element of truth. Also very pleased that Darren alluded to this question of what goes on in the globe and the character of Christianity worldwide. The matter of the global South. Now that was, for a while, I had a seventh thing that I thought was distinctive about the book that I was going to list at the start, and I knew I was getting near the end of my time. I don't know very many studies of American Christianity that make as much as I do of what happens with the expansion of Christianity in the global South. And I'm saying that in many ways, this is a different franchise, but that the evangelicals who are allied with the conservative values of much of the global South Christianity are using it as a sort of club to beat secularism over the head. What do you mean we've got secularization? There are more Christians in the world than ever before. Well, is our only definition of a Christian self-profession? I guess I'm arguing that historians should not be intimidated by the definitions of Christianity offered by the Pope, offered by any church. We historians should be in charge of our own episteme. And if we want to define what Christianity is from a historical perspective, we should go ahead and do it. And if that means that we make distinctions between this or that Nigerian or Ugandan or Brazilian bishop and the Archbishop of Canterbury, let us do that distinction. Let us not allow the Anglican Communion to decide what is a Christian. So this world historical perspective is so important to me. Finally, Darren gets into the question of what is to be done. And it's true that I play with that a little bit at the end. And yes, I'm a big defender of higher education. And I quote Joe Badgett and a lot of other people and John Dewey on that. And it's easy to say there's no hope. It's easy to say that too many things have already gone against the Enlightenment, that the uncompleted project of the Enlightenment shall never be completed. I understand why it's easy to think that today. I would answer with James Russell Lowell, how weak an arm may turn the iron helm of fate. So we have to do what we can on that. One thing that would link these comments of Darren's to something that Melanie said that I want to elaborate on. What is to be done? I think that these increasingly progressive evangelical preachers have a very important role to play. The evangelical preachers have a credibility with a lot of the voters that are fomenting, facilitating, constituting this country's crisis of democracy. A free thinker like myself has no influence with these people. Evangelical preachers do. So we all should speak to whatever community we can influence. And intellect always works best in the context of fellow feeling. And so when we're talking about how diverse evangelicalism is and how there are all these quarrels within it, and Melanie's right about that. Well, I would say to a lot of these evangelical preachers, don't be afraid of ecumenical Protestants. Don't be afraid of free thinkers. I mean, if you've got a take on Christianity that will be consistent with the values that the progressive evangelicals now articulating, go for it. And I think the great example in a political context there is Liz Cheney. she's not doing this in a religious context. She's doing it in a political context. But the more evangelical preachers that can do in evangelical circles what Liz Cheney is doing in Republican circles, I say that's all to the good. Finally, I said there was something else in Melody's comments that I wanted to pick up on briefly before we go to other questions. And this has to do with the character of the debates within the evangelical community. And there I was struck again and again by the persistence of a individual salvationist perspective, like, well, we have to do away with racism. It's a terrible thing, but it's an evil of the human heart, and we shouldn't meddle in politics. We should wait until human hearts are changed, as opposed to the ecumenical Protestants who regarded it as a religious duty, not a political add-on to do something about the evils around them. Now, by and large, I mean, there are exceptions to this, but I saw an awful lot of evangelicals in these various arguments who came back to that. I'd be delighted to have it shown to me that that's now an anachronism. Finally, one example in this light that has to do with who won these arguments, who is winning these arguments within evangelicalism. And I'll tell a story that I think I can tell now, although at the time that it happened to me, I swore this person to secrecy. This person swore me to secrecy. About 2000, I don't know, but 10 years ago, this involves Richard Cizik, very important lobbyist for the National Association of Evangelicals. Richard Cizik was fired because he deviated from the abortion, same-sex agenda of the National Association of Evangelicals. Stressed the environment, poverty, social justice. He was thrown out. Now, what's relevant about this is that he and I were on a panel here in, I don't know what, 2006, maybe 2007, before he was fired. He gave a speech, and this was to, this was to a large Jewish group. This was a Jewish synagogue in San Francisco. So he gives this speech, and these are people that haven't been following evangelical politics. He gives a speech which is right out of the Christian century in 1955. So I go up to Richard afterward. I say, do you realize that you, as the spokesman for evangelicalism, are basically voicing liberal Protestantism? And he said, I don't think he would mind at all my telling this story if he's in on this today. He said, he looked around to make sure there wasn't anybody listening. Then he said, yes, I have found that the only way to make progress with evangelicals is to present progressive ideas as conservative. And that's what I always try to do. So the voice that I've had today is my voice. But no, I cannot use it in evangelical company. I can only use it here. So this speaks to the structure of debates within evangelicalism. I'll stop there, Eric, and let you invoke others.
Thank you. We have a number of people with hands up and a number of comments in the Q&A, but I can't resist starting off with a question. And it centers on the decline of mainline denominations, churches from the 60s into the 1970s. And you list a number of factors, but politics is one of them. And it's not just a question of race, but it's stances taken on a variety of political issues, such as normalization of relations with Cuba, Palestinian independence, and so forth. And you write at one point that this gap between a cosmopolitan leadership and a provincial laity within these churches widened. Church leadership found themselves on the defensive, and the budget of these organizations, dropped tremendously. So thinking about the 60s and the politicization of so much in that period of time, how would you weight, or how much weight would you place on leadership within the mainline churches, their adoption of politics that were to the left of their membership, contributing to membership decline over the next decade and beyond? How much weight would you put on that?
The reason that's a difficult question, although I think an important one, is that it seems to me that during that late 60s, early 70s period, the leadership of ecumenical Protestantism, the people of the National Council of Churches, especially, and the leaders of the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, they were going much too fast and too far for a lot of people in the church pews. And this is one of the reasons that they lose a lot of their financial support, and why you have at least a small number of people going over to the evangelical churches. But at the same time, they're not moving nearly fast enough and nearly far enough for a lot of the young people. And so the exodus, which has been well documented by a lot of the sociologists, the exodus happens because a lot of young people decide that they really believe in a lot of these progressive values taught to them by their Congregationalist and their Methodist pastors. They believe in those things, but in order to advance them, you do not need the church. So they leave the churches in droves, beginning about 1966, 67, 68. The decline levels off by the end of the 20th century, but the Methodists had lost nearly 30% of their members during the course of those 30 to 35 years. And it's very heavily because of the young people. So I think the answer to your question, the best that I can do with it is to say that it's not a matter of just waiting on the one side, it's waiting on both. I would say that the ecumenical leadership was caught in one of the contradictions of history for which there was not a good solution. Now, if you were to look back on it, just make one more comment about it. If you're looking at it from the point of view of a Christian survivalist, and you want these institutions to survive, it's conceivable that these guys went too fast. It's conceivable that they shouldn't have backed the Soviet-supported anti-colonial people in Mozambique. It's possible that they shouldn't have backed the Wounded Knee people. Those volatile choices that they made really upset a lot of the people in the pews. I think they might have lost a lot of the young people anyway. The liberal leadership was desperately trying to hold on to the young. So by the early 70s, when they see this vast hemorrhage, they're trying to catch up with all the young people that are leaving. In trying to catch up, I think they damaged the constituency that they still had in their churches. That's the best I can do with that.
Thanks very much. We have a number of people with hands up. When we call on you, unmute yourself and pose your question. Marina Ottaway, your hand is up. Please unmute.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I have two comments question. And the first one, the reason why I first put up my hand was that I was very struck that in this discussion of this secularism and Christianity in the United States, nobody mentioned the Catholic Church. And that's just a question I have. I don't have a particular, I'm not pushing a point of view, but I was very struck about the absence of any mention of it. The second one, and this is a kind of it's a very tentative comment, but I was also very struck by the parallel that I find about this discussion of the evangelicals and some of the discussions that you find, some of the explanation that you find for the rise of Islamic fundamentalism among Muslims, in particularly those living in Europe, and I'm thinking here about the writing of Olivier Roy on this, that the fact that what the fundamentalists are offering is a version of Islam that does not really ask you to think very much or to know very much about Islam. And I'm wondering whether there is a parallel here with the evangelicals.
Thank you. David?
Can I answer that? Yeah.
Yes.
No matter of the dynamic between conservative, reactionary, and liberal Enlightenment versions of other religions was something that I thought was beyond me here. I mean, this question is an important one, and there's quite a lot of debate about it, going all the way back to all those volumes on fundamentalism worldwide that Martin Marty and his friends edited, 40 or 50 years ago. So that's beyond what I'm trying to do here. I thought it would get in the way of the points that I was trying to make if I really went that way. Secondly, my 19-minute summary at the beginning does a real injustice to my book, in that I do talk quite a lot about Catholicism and Catholics. I didn't invoke any of that here. I'll just say that about now, that the old white European ethnic base for the Catholic Church declined by 40% between about 1965 and about 2005. So there's a lot of parallels, and the development of post-Catholicism is very similar to the development of post-Protestantism. It's a matter of numbers. They're not nearly as many. Also, as Catholics achieved upward social mobility, they moved largely from the Democrats to almost evenly divided between the Republicans and the Democrats. So nowadays you've got, people like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden are Catholics, but so is the Attorney General Barr and Speaker McCarthy. So the Catholics present a different connection for the political culture of the United States. But this questioner is absolutely correct that a full account of this has to incorporate the history of Catholicism. And I'm sorry that in my opening comments, I failed to flag that.
You only have so much time, and you covered a lot of ground. Leon Fink's hand is up. If you would unmute, you know the routine.
Thank you. This is directed at David and Darren and Melody as well, if they'd like. But I was struck by the way, at least in his brief summary, that David connected the ecumenical Christian project to effectively the New Deal era and the rise of the liberalism of the New Deal. And Darren likewise associated the decline of that movement and the rise or the dominance of the evangelical tradition to invoking Kirkpatrick Sale's take on a changing political economy of the country. And so I'm wondering if all of you as religious and intellectual historians would consider whether, in fact, to what extent is the fate of these religious traditions fundamentally tied to changes in the political economy and the politics in the country. And that is liberalism. Is liberalism the effect of a stalking horse here, not the church per se? And is post-Protestantism just one form of a move away from the significance of the church as an organizing principle? Or not all these, have we moved to effectively, while there's still plenty of churches and they're organized people, but are we in a post-religious period today where the churches are really kind of stalking horses for a political position in relation to the liberal tradition?
Thank you.
Leon, I appreciate that point. And it may be that Melanie and Darren have more to say about it. I would observe that politics and religion in the United States have always been very intimately entwined with one another. And I guess I would resist the idea that you've got politics over here and religion over here, and one causes the other. So insofar as one would want to claim, and I don't hear this from you, Leon, but I have heard it from time to time from others, that religion is altogether, a result rather than a cause. It's epiphenomenal. And that all you have to do is look at the politics and economy of the country, and then you can understand religion as something that's following from that. I don't think that's right. I think there's much more of a dialectical thing. And, the development of the New Deal has many sources, but among them was the traditional social gospel liberal Protestant tradition of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is one of the things that goes into that, just as surely as the recent developments in evangelical politics are closely connected to the anti-regulation policies of a lot of the magnates like Howard Pugh that orchestrated the rise of the religious right. So I don't think that we're in a post-religious age. I think we're in an age where religion is actually in its reactionary form playing a sharper role than it has for a long time. And it just seems to me that it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think the post-Protestants themselves are not altogether the same people politically. There's a division within them, to be sure, and the same applies to the post-Catholics. But it may be that Darren and Melanie have a more pointed response to Leon's concern.
Darren or Melanie?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll point you to one of David's recent graduate students, Gene Zubovich, who has just published an outstanding book, and I'm going to have a chance to celebrate that with him in a couple of weeks. Before the Religious Right, I believe, David, it's called. And Leon, in many ways, addresses this very point, both on a domestic and especially kind of foreign policy, human rights basis. The New Deal liberal order was in many ways inspired, surprisingly, and informed by kind of the progressive Christianity that David highlights here. The reciprocal was true as well, provided a forum, provided a foundation, a structure within which the values celebrated and advanced by liberal Christianity could kind of find concrete form and be translated into policy. So in very important organic ways, kind of the religious and political dimensions of liberalism reinforce one another. And as David suggests, certainly in my own work, trying not necessarily to reduce religion to politics or to economics, but to see how, certainly in the life of modern America, these clusters of concerns and interests and influences have often worked together. And so to unpack them, to understand some of the challenges of today, we need to reckon with all of those. Anyway, so I think Gene's book will help you perhaps clarify and certainly wrestle with some of these entanglements.
Melanie?
And I don't have a lot to say about this, but I'll just add that I think that when we take a global perspective, however, we see the ways in which people who are very poor and do not have very many resources, say the Christians in South Sudan, can take a major global role in shaping conversation if they get the attention of certain groups of American Christians. It's not really necessarily about who has the economic resources, but where kind of moral authority has been placed or how moral authority has shaped the ways that so-called persecuted Christians or have a certain kind of voice in the global, not just in the US, but internationally altogether. So I don't think Darren suggested this, and I don't think we'd say that religion follows the money. There's money matters, but there's a lot of other ways that shape where authority comes from and who is heard.
Thank you so much. I have the very unfortunate task of drawing this to a close. Our time is up. I still have hands up. We still have people with questions in the Q&A. So my apologies to everyone who's been waiting patiently. I think we could have gone on for a lot longer than we actually can. So I want to thank David, Darren, and Melanie for this very rich conversation. And thank you, Christian. I'm going to turn this back to you for final words, sir.
Thank you. My thanks also to David, Darren, and Melanie, and of course you, Eric, for running the show. I'd like to invite you to 2 sessions next week, not one, but 2 sessions. On Monday, October 24th, we'll have a conversation about Elizabeth Leake's new book, Afghan Crucible, as mentioned. And then on Tuesday, we'll be talking about Caroline Elkin's new book, Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire. You're warmly invited to both events, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, be safe. Good night. Take care. And thank you all.